The most dangerous opponent in tennis isn't always standing across the net. Sometimes, it's the injury you can't see. For Carlos Alcaraz, that opponent has been hiding inside his right wrist for more than 4 months. And now, after missing some of the biggest tournaments of the season, the 23-year-old has made a decision that could define the next chapter of his career. He's coming back. The US Open, New York, Arthur Ashe Stadium. A Grand Slam title to defend. And almost no competitive tennis behind him. On August 20th, Alcaraz officially confirmed that he will return at the 2026 US Open after a 4-month absence caused by his right wrist injury. His message was short, "I'm back." But behind those 3 words is one of the most fascinating questions in tennis right now. Is Carlos Alcaraz truly ready to compete again? Or is he simply ready to try? Because those 2 things are very different. And this comeback isn't happening after a normal few weeks of rest. Alcaraz has been away from official competition since April. His last match came at the Barcelona Open on April 14th, when he defeated Otto Virtanen in the opening round before withdrawing from the tournament because of the wrist problem. From there, the situation became much bigger. Madrid disappeared from the schedule. Then Rome, then Roland Garros, then Queens, then Wimbledon. And eventually, the North American hard-court swing was gone as well. The defending US Open champion wasn't building momentum. He was watching the season from the sidelines. And that is where this story becomes much more complicated than simply asking whether his wrist hurts. Because Alcaraz doesn't play ordinary tennis. His game is built around explosive acceleration, heavy forehands, rapid changes of direction, late contact, extreme racket head speed, touch shots, drop shots, serve acceleration, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to produce enormous racket head speed while improvising under pressure. His body isn't simply moving through space, it is constantly absorbing and redirecting force. That is why a wrist injury can become such a serious problem for a player whose entire game depends on aggressive racket acceleration. But here's the distinction that matters. There is no public evidence that Alcaraz has been diagnosed with permanent joint damage. There is no confirmed medical report saying that his wrist has reached some irreversible biological limit, and there is no basis for telling viewers that his career is already being permanently damaged. What we actually know is more interesting. He has been forced to stop. He has been forced to wait, and his team has been unwilling to rush the comeback. That caution has already cost him enormous competitive opportunities. Alcaraz completed the career Grand Slam at the Australian Open earlier this year, and started 2026 with a remarkable 22-3 record. Then his wrist injury changed everything. The player who had spent years building momentum suddenly had to learn the hardest lesson in professional sport. Sometimes the smartest move is doing absolutely nothing. Roland Garros became the first major casualty. The official French Open site reported that Alcaraz decided to remain cautious and withdraw from Rome and Roland Garros while waiting to evaluate his recovery. Then came Wimbledon. On May 19th, Alcaraz confirmed that he would also miss Queens and Wimbledon because he was still not ready to compete. For a defending champion, that is brutal, not only because of the trophies, not only because of the ranking points, but because tennis players live on rhythm, match rhythm, competitive rhythm. The feeling of playing points when the score is 5-5, the pressure of serving at 30-30, the reaction required when an opponent suddenly changes direction, the ability to trust your body without thinking about it. Training can reproduce some of those situations, but it cannot completely reproduce a Grand Slam match. And that is the biggest question surrounding Alcaraz in New York. Can you go from 4 months without an official match directly into best-of-5 tennis? Because the US Open isn't asking Alcaraz to hit a few comfortable forehands. It's asking him to survive. 5 sets. Long rallies, explosive movement, repeated serving, constant braking and acceleration, mental pressure, and potentially several matches in a single fortnight. That is an entirely different physical examination, and Alcaraz knows it, which is why one recent training session attracted so much attention. On August 17th, Alcaraz trained in Murcia with Holger Rune. The session was significant because both players were working their way back from injury, and Alcaraz was finally able to test himself in a serious high-level practice environment. The ATP Tour documented the session, including Alcaraz working with his physiotherapist before taking the court. This wasn't a tournament. There was no ranking point, no five-set scoreboard, no Grand Slam pressure, but it was still an important signal. Alcaraz was increasing the intensity. He was hitting, he was serving, he was moving. And, most importantly, he was testing the wrist against another elite player. Then came the decision. August 20. The uncertainty ended. Carlos Alcaraz announced that he would compete at the US Open. The defending champion is going back to New York. And suddenly, the entire story changed. This is no longer, will Alcaraz recover in time? Now it's, what will Alcaraz look like when he returns? Because there are at least 3 versions of this comeback. The first is the dream scenario. Alcaraz walks onto Arthur Ashe Stadium and immediately looks like Carlos Alcaraz again. The forehand is exploding. The movement is sharp. The serve is aggressive. The wrist is invisible in his mind. And suddenly, the 4-month absence becomes irrelevant. That version of the story ends with Alcaraz making another deep run in New York, maybe even defending the title. But there is a second possibility, and this one is far more intriguing. Alcaraz returns physically healthy, but tactically different. Maybe he doesn't try to overwhelm every opponent immediately. Maybe he protects the wrist by choosing when to accelerate. Maybe he relies more heavily on court positioning. Maybe he uses his drop shot and net game more intelligently. Maybe he makes rallies shorter. Maybe he becomes more selective with his explosive movements. And perhaps this injury forces one of the most naturally gifted young players in tennis to become even smarter. That could actually make him more dangerous in the long term, because Alcaraz doesn't need to hit maximum power on every point. He only needs to know when maximum power matters. That is the lesson players like Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic learned over many years. Longevity isn't about remaining physically identical. It's about adapting before your body forces you to. And then there's the third scenario, the uncomfortable one. Alcaraz may be healthy enough to play, but not fully match-ready. And that difference could become visible very quickly. The first set might look brilliant. The second might be competitive. But what happens after 2.5 hours? What happens if he reaches a 4th set tiebreak? What happens if an opponent repeatedly attacks his forehand? What happens if he has to serve for the match after 3 hours? What happens when adrenaline tells him to go for a shot that his body isn't completely ready to repeat? That is where this comeback becomes a genuine test. Not of talent. We already know he has that. Not of courage. We've seen enough evidence of that too. This is a test of restraint. And restraint may be the hardest skill for an athlete whose greatest weapon is explosiveness. There's another twist making this US Open particularly fascinating. World number 1 Jannik Sinner has withdrawn from the tournament with a right knee injury, opening a completely different landscape at the top of the men's draw. The official US Open site noted that Djokovic's path toward a possible 25th Grand Slam title has opened, while Alcaraz himself remains a major question mark because he is returning from his wrist injury. So Alcaraz isn't returning to a normal US Open. He's returning to a tournament where the entire competitive hierarchy has already been disrupted, and that creates an enormous opportunity, but also enormous pressure. Remember what Alcaraz accomplished before the injury. He won the Australian Open. That victory completed his career Grand Slam at just 22 years old. He entered the season looking like a player capable of dominating an era. Then, everything stopped. 4 months later, he's walking back into the biggest tournament in the world. That's why the US Open may tell us something far more important than whether Carlos Alcaraz can win another Grand Slam. It may tell us what kind of player he is going to become. The old Alcaraz was built around chaos, explosive forehands, lightning movement, unpredictable shot-making, physical intensity, constant pressure. But the next Alcaraz may need something else: efficiency, control, shot selection, load management, patience, and perhaps a slightly different relationship with his own body. Because the objective isn't to win one tournament. It's to remain capable of winning tournaments for the next decade. And that is why rushing back would make very little sense. The fact that Alcaraz waited 4 months before returning to competition tells us something about how seriously his team has treated the problem. He missed Roland Garros. He missed Wimbledon. He missed Toronto. He missed Cincinnati. And now he's returning without a conventional hard-court tournament buildup. That is an enormous competitive gamble. But it may also be the most sensible option available, because there was never going to be a perfect comeback. At some point, he had to play again, and apparently, that moment is New York. The fascinating part is that Alcaraz has already shown us that he can reinvent himself. His tennis has evolved incredibly quickly since he first exploded onto the ATP Tour. He has improved his serve. He has become more comfortable at the net. His tactical awareness has matured. His ability to defend and attack within the same rally has become one of the defining characteristics of his game. So perhaps the wrist injury doesn't have to represent the beginning of decline. Perhaps it becomes the beginning of evolution. That's the optimistic interpretation. But nobody knows yet, and that's what makes this story so compelling. The first few matches in New York will provide clues. Watch his serve. Watch how often he attacks with the forehand. Watch whether he looks comfortable accelerating through contact. Watch what happens after long rallies. Watch whether he protects certain positions. Watch his body language after difficult points. And most importantly, watch whether he trusts the wrist. Because an injury can heal physically before an athlete completely trusts the body again. That psychological element is almost impossible to measure from the outside. You can clear a medical test. You can complete a training session. You can hit hundreds of balls. But when the match is on the line, the body has to believe again. That's the real comeback. Not walking onto the court, trusting the body once you're there. And Carlos Alcaraz now has the ultimate test waiting for him. The US Open begins on August 30th. The defending champion is coming back after more than 4 months away. He has no traditional warm-up tournament behind him. He has spent months protecting an injured wrist, while the rest of the tour continued without him. And now, suddenly, the spotlight returns. No excuses, no hiding. No more rehabilitation videos, just tennis. 1 point at a time, 1 match at a time, and one enormous question. Can Carlos Alcaraz return from the longest injury absence of his career and immediately play the explosive tennis that made him one of the greatest young champions in the sport? Or will this injury force him to discover a completely different version of himself? Maybe the old Alcaraz wanted to win every point with brilliance. Maybe the next Alcaraz will learn to win by choosing his moments. And if he can make that transformation, this injury could eventually become something very different from the career threat everyone feared. It could become a turning point, because champions aren't defined only by how they perform when their bodies are perfect. They're defined by what they do when something goes wrong. Carlos Alcaraz has already conquered every Grand Slam. He has already reached world number 1. He has already completed the career Grand Slam. Now comes a completely different challenge. Not conquering an opponent, not conquering a tournament, but learning how to protect the body that made all of those achievements possible. The countdown to New York has begun, and when Carlos Alcaraz walks onto Arthur Ashe Stadium, the tennis world won't just be watching a defending champion. They'll be watching the first chapter of the next version of Carlos Alcaraz. If you want the latest Alcaraz injury and US Open updates, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this comeback could become one of the biggest stories of the entire 2026 tennis season.